Following on from an earlier panel on data security, this is a bit of another flavor on that, specifically called data dominance. We're going to dig into what that means here in a minute. I'm going to introduce my panelists here. We have Darren Death. He's the CISO, Chief Privacy Officer, Deputy Chief AI Officer at Export-Import Bank. Well, welcome. Glad you're here. Next to him, we have Gus Tomei, President of Foxhole Technology. Thank you for being here, Gus.
Thank you for having me.
Justin Hubert, Division Chief for Cybersecurity and Operations at Federal Transit Administration under the Transportation Department. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you.
And finally, Jeff Hyacinth, OS Associate CDO at Interior. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Many of these panelists, something they have in common is the ACT-IACT cybersecurity community of interest, whether they're members or chairs of some of the efforts there. We're going to dig into some of the work that they're doing as part of that COI. So first, I want to start with a quick lightning round for everyone. Quickly, define data dominance for us. What does that really mean? Darren?
So it's kind of in the word, right? Data dominance. So the idea here is that through OMB memorandum, we're supposed to have all the information, all IT information. I think it was mentioned earlier today. All IT information is cyber information. So just being able to make sure you have all the information, that you're able to retain it and have control over it, understand context, and be able to properly protect the organization with this information versus just compliance. We know compliance isn't security, so not focusing on just the OMB memoranda and having the information, but actually doing meaningful things with the information.
Great summation. Gus?
So data dominance, I look at that as from an industry perspective, an agency's ability, because everyone's mission is different, whether it's defense, whether it's critical infrastructure protection, whether it's banking. The dominance piece is around understanding the data flows, what's coming in, what's coming out, owning and having full visibility and transparency in what those, to include areas that you're outsourcing, you have a vendor providing, so you would have fidelity in the ability to see what they're doing with your data. So owning that as it aligns to your particular mission, for sure.
Dominance is knowledge. Is what I'm hearing. Justin?
What else do I need to say? No. So I'm going to kind of go to the 10,000 foot level, right? So you have data and you're trying to get a strategic advantage out of it. Typically, we're looking at this from like a nation state or large organization, global organization perspective, but we really start drilling down into it. Again, at the OMB memorandum level, we start looking at it from a cyber data perspective. Just want to kind of note that data itself is being seen largely as a strategic resource across nation states and global markets. So from that perspective, understanding what you've got, actioning it quickly gets you a strategic advantage. That's data dominance in a nutshell.
Great. Jeff?
What else could I add?
No pressure.
I would say that it's from a data governance perspective, it is a intentional strategic approach, right, in which organizations should be collecting, governing, and analyzing its data so thoroughly that it achieves a proactive cybersecurity driven advantage. And so I want to put the emphasis on the proactiveness as opposed to the reactiveness that it historically, and I guess in a cybersecurity context, has been viewed as kind of like policy compliance and things like that. This is really getting at the heart and driving it into security operations and those workflows.
Fantastic. I heard a lot of good things that I know we're going to be digging into here in a minute. So let's start really big picture. We heard your take on what data dominance means, really, maybe a couple highlights there. But what does data dominance mean in your organization? You're each from such a different agency or a different, in this case, there's also an industry perspective here. What does it mean for your organization? What does it mean for cybersecurity? Darren?
So I thought I would just pick up on like a few of the boring administrative details. Okay. That's some of my favorite things to talk about. So, and they're usually the areas that are missed by a lot of people. Was talking with someone yesterday about the MGM attack, where And in some cases, it still seems like there's still some issues. They're still recovering after years, and it fell down to help desk individual providing a reset on an MFA token, right? So again, boring administrative details. So in order to have data dominance, like one of the things you need to be able to focus on are like, what are your assets? Right, and it just seems like such a mundane thing. But if you go into places and you look at asset management, configuration management, change management, organizations are still struggling at it, right? So in order to have data dominance, you got to focus on that boring administrative detail. Actually understand what all your assets are. Another boring administrative detail, what are your business units doing, right? Your mission units, your business units. Going into zero trust and talking about conditional access, right? Because that's what we're doing with this data, right? Is making decisions. So how can you actually know what unusual behavior looks like if you don't know what business units are doing, right? So if you have someone who seems to have an impossible login scenario, right? They're logging in Maryland and they're logging in California a few hours later. Well, what's their job, right? So you have to be able to understand the context. Otherwise, you could actually be seriously limiting your organization. So those are some of like the little things, or I guess they're big things, and really hard to do, right? Because when you're talking about understanding your mission and business, those are soft skills. You're actually working with different team members, right? And a lot of IT folks and cyber folks don't want to do that, right? So in order to be able to understand those context things, because you can get all the data in the world, you can have your data feeds out of your HR system and understand what different things are occurring within the organization. But if you aren't actually communicating and understanding what the business unit's doing, what the HR is doing, do you have things classified so you understand what different kinds of employees are and how they're logging into environments, then you're not going to be able to make the right decisions. You're probably going to make security decisions that are going to cause issues, and then that's where you start having that lack of trust, and then now you're having to backtrack and have to, interact with your leadership in a way that you don't want to. So I think that's probably a key area you could focus on to make the best out of that data.
Sure. I saw Jeff and Justin shaking their heads. I'm assuming that it sounds a lot, but even the different mission sets that your agencies have, it sounds pretty similar.
Yes. I would group that into strategic alignment, right? And we talked about it from many mission priority initiatives, such as zero trust, data governance, and this data dominance gives a framework to align on that more comprehensively. All of our agencies collect tens of millions of data points daily, right? And so success should hinge on having that type of a comprehensive framework and that type of strategic alignment. And then uniquely, or maybe not uniquely, but from my government experiences, I would say that it also drives technology enablement, right? So as folks are thinking about the roadmap and where investments need to be made and what strategic partnerships with industry, taking a data dominance perspective really helps you ascertain how those modular pieces come together.
Anything to add, Justin?
Yeah, so data is the key word, right? And the reason I'm kind of pointing that out, it's obvious, but it harkens back to something Darren said initially, which was fundamentals. When I keep thinking about data and data dominance in organization or across the various working groups that I've had, being able to operationalize and action data as a resource and an element is something that is a big struggle, it appears. We got a lot of silos. We have business units who are, let's say a little jealous of their data, right? They don't necessarily want to share, and sometimes for good reason, right? If you've set up a whole bunch of rules and you have things set out where you get to see the output and it's this way, and you put a lot of work into it, and somebody takes it and chops it up and makes something different, do those align? Do they talk to each other? So there's some reasons for all this, and we have to overcome these challenges. And so when I think about data dominance, I first think about the foundations of data in terms of ensuring good governance, being able to have a common language, and really being able to break down silos, as well as ensuring we have appropriate access to data, whether that's scoped down or broadened, depending on the use case. So there's a lot of challenges, is what it boils down to.
Sure.
On the to operate and make this more like useful, right? Data dominance helps unify across environments, so on-prem, cloud, hybrid, a unified policy, right? And it should cascade down to, identity, access management, as well as just the entire data lifecycle, from collection to publication and archiving, and that tends to lift people up out of those silos that we're talking about here. And so I know when we all came together to, under Act IAC, to write the white paper, that was a central point for us, right? Now, it's not so much about how the organizations we're affiliated with are configured or architected, or what tech stack they're involved, they're leveraging. We were able to really boil this down to some of these fundamentals and craft or connect to a unifying policy that we hope, as folks read, will be able to take back to their own organizations and leverage.
Sure. I heard a lot about solutions, partnerships, probably piquing your interest, Gus. What are your thoughts?
So I think from an industry perspective of having been an engineer for many, many years, I think one of the biggest things that always stuns me about the data dominance, question, or the data question, right, is the fact that data is, we think of it as just data that allows us to do our job every day, but it's actually intellectual property. It belongs, it has a tangible asset. It belongs to the mission that you're trying to accomplish, the investments that you're making, all the tools, all the pieces that industry provides. How can you validate you're getting the most effectiveness out of those tools if you're not measuring the data flows, the continuity of that data, how it's being proliferated across? You don't have transparency around those things. So the data dominance envelope has to be able to measure the effectiveness, because you can write policy all day long, and I think we can all agree on the cybersecurity landscape, if you try to apply a framework to a living organism called cybersecurity that's constantly morphing and constantly changing, your policy is never going to be effectively applied or be able to be applied, because this is a moving target where this is a static target. So the only way to get alignment between the policy side and the framework side is you have to have the fluid, you have to be able to measure, you have to be able to look, you have to have the transparency, you have to say, how effective is it? Do I need to pull back an investment and put more investment here? Industry, I need tools that do this kind of thing, not things that do that kind of thing, right? So I think when you put it in that aspect, the data dominance piece from a framework, from a policy, from an enforcement, and the visibility is vital to cybersecurity. Most people look at cybersecurity as it is the end all. It's just a component of actual data dominance, of making data dominance effective, essentially.
Very interesting. And I know we're going to get into a little bit of what goes on behind those decisions with tooling and how you really budget for that, I guess. But top of mind for many in this room, and we've heard it throughout the day today, is compliance. I know you said it's not just about compliance, but the reality is there are certain memos out there. I'll call out M2131, which, as we know, directs federal agencies to improve cybersecurity logging, log retention, management. So what is necessary to, yes, it's not about just compliance, but you do still have to comply. So what are your thoughts there, Darren?
So it's three main things, right? So you have to get the data, you have to retain the data, and then you have to do something with the data, right? So when you're getting the data, we talked about that. You got to figure out what all the things are, right? So you got to go, all sorts of things, right? So whether it's, like we talk about HR data, whether it's IoT systems, whether it's cloud systems, custom developed systems, you need to get all the data to where you can actually do something with it. And then you need to retain the data, and you should do it in the most cost-effective way. Not everything is actionable. The memoranda has a requirement for retention, right? So we can do forensics if there's an issue, things like that. But also, in order to be able to do the security side, you can make decisions on where data goes. You have to make those sort of, I wouldn't call them necessarily compromises, but you decide where you want to have things so that you can have the most cost-effective operation as possible. And then you need to do something with it, right? And that's where I think really the security aspect comes into it. So you're getting the data, you're retaining it, you're making sure that you're meeting that requirement. But then now you've triaged that information. You're making sure you've got that the information you actually need to do your cybersecurity job, and that you're bringing the right tools to bear. You've got the right analysts, and as we're seeing AI proliferate. My hope, I keep saying, we talked about it here, I keep using this term, tier one SOC in a box, which of course always brings other issues along with it. If the AI is your tier one, then where are you going to get your tier 2s and 3s in the future? But I think that that's going to be a really key thing as we're talking about for future, for analysis is, there's just some attacks that are, when you're talking about an ATP, a very highly funded organization, whether they're criminals or nation states, they're coming in, they're loitering, they have the resources to get in, and they're happy to stay there for a long time. And the tools and just the human mind can't deal with that kind of information. But if we're able to bring tools to bear, hopefully, I think we're getting really close to where we are able to kind of have that analysis, at that broader data perspective, right? So you've got your tools you're used to seeing now, your SIMs, your different sorts of log analysis tools, but then being able to have kind of that broader data lake where you're just looking at all the data points and just treat every piece of data as though it's suspect, and let that persona of that tier one SOC analyst actually just kind of pour through every single data and just follow it where it goes. And then you just might find, I think you will find just, those places where the ATPs are hanging out. You're going to start seeing that in that data. So.
Okay.
If you just focus on visibility, I think you'll find yourself being incompliant with the memo, right? And what do I mean by visibility? That's enhanced event logging, right? And just making that kind of core to your practice. Our research, when we were writing the white paper and other research, does suggest like unified log data, right? Whether that's within a security data lake or some other, well-configured SIEM solution, focusing and driving at visibility so that nothing slips through the crack. We were talking about that in the green room, like that. From my perspective, I think really drives that. And when you do focus on visibility, now you're going to be focusing on every single data point, regardless of the domain. And there are technologies out there, because I think the other piece of it would be resource planning, including emerging technologies that would allow you to do what human intelligence hasn't been able to do, which is to keep track and process every single terabyte of data that gets generated in an organization. And so where we're able to augment our human intelligence with enhanced visibility and like techniques for signal processing, I think an organization will find themselves just naturally compliant.
Sure. Justin, I know you spoke about this recently. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing is we kind of need to set the bar for what is compliance, right? So there's 4 compliance levels, and the first one is we kind of hope you're doing something, right? Not effective is what we call it. And then EL1, so where we really start actually seeing something happen. We have basic logging, we have some retention, and it's pulling of the data, right? So that's our first one. Now the second one, we start really enhancing that with some behavioral recognition, like diving into the data. We enhance the data, enrich it, if you will, right? We add more elements to make the fact that when we're looking at it, we understand more and can pull more out of it. And we're setting up for tooling like SOAR, right? Security, orchestration, and all that. So that's hard to get to, just EL2. EL3 is where we've got fully fledged SOAR, and we've got a lot of capabilities around storage. And there's some pretty high bars from a storage perspective that we have to hit. There's a requirement for 72-hour packet capture. That is an insane amount of fresh, hot storage ready to go. Yeah. And that's a really high bar for a lot of organizations, regardless of size, to meet. And the bigger ones may be able to hit it, but most of the smaller ones aren't. So when we're talking about compliance, just getting the basics of M2131 down is a huge challenge. GAO just came out, just in 2024 came out with a report. 3 agencies out of 24 had hit EL3. 3. So when we talk about compliance, I agree. Visibility will probably get you there, but what level and how deep? We have a big challenge trying to get the compliance level up appropriately. And current tooling efforts are they're not tackling the problem the way we'd like them to. So again, back to industry, and this is a good pitch to him how do we get there, and here's what we need, how are we going to resource this, what are you going to bring to the table? So threw it up for you.
Yeah, no, that's perfect, because I think the big issue, I always like to joke, and we were talking about it, what's the biggest problem with big data? Data, right? I mean, that is the biggest challenge, right? So the human body, the human brain cannot process the volume and be able to do that. And when we are in a constant reactive posture, you're not doing cybersecurity, you're doing cybersecurity compliance. And so from the perspective of, you're compliant, but you're not getting in a predictive, or you're not getting in an active role, right? So how do you do that with tool sets that are out there, or policies that only talk about storage per se? But I'm looking at what happened to the house when it burned, after it burned down. How about I want to look at the things that keep it from burning down in the first place? And that's where industry needs to work with the compliance side to be able to say there's the static piece of it, but then there's that dynamic piece, and creating tools and methodologies that augment the guidance piece, the regulatory piece, the policy piece, to make it more of an actual organism, that tool capability, something that moves it forward. So we're doing predictive threat analytics before the attack actually happens. We're saying, well, I've got 10 years worth of data, and I guess now I need to do all the forensics around it. What tools out there that I could do that with? Yeah. Whereas if I'm doing it in live stream while it's actually happening, now I'm able to block and tackle a lot more effectively, which gets me to my compliance, but takes it beyond compliance to actually protective mechanisms, to be able to self-heal, those types of self-react, containment. So the big word that everyone likes to use is resilience, right? So that gets me to a resilient state through data dominance. And that's not just like zero trust. I always like to make the joke, there's a lot of people who think zero trust is I just buy it and I plug it in and I have zero trust. No, it is a layered approach. It's a defense in depth. It's a multi-tiered factor that gets into all the different aspects. And so I think the biggest thing from an industry perspective is how do we shift the aperture from a compliance checklist storage to more of a proactive, reactive when need, and be able to analyze on the fly what's happening within the network. So that's the visibility, that's the transparency. I know what's happening. And then there's cost efficiencies that come from the tooling as well, because I have a data set and I'm looking at the data set from one particular issue, maybe it's cybersecurity, but what about future planning and investment? What about rapid prototyping, because new emerging threats are coming? Do I need to now send out a new contract or buy a new tool to be able to analyze this portion of it? Well, if I already have the data, why can't I look at the data from a different angle of the prism and be able to make a rapid look at, hey, maybe these 3 tools could be able to do that. So from an industry perspective, we have a very vital piece that connects into not only the management of the compliance, the checklist part of it, and I'm not saying that's not a good thing, you gotta have the framework. But the framework cannot be a static thing. It needs to be a live, evolving thing that allows to evolve with the mission and move forward with the mission.
So being parts of organizations that are very large, and Justin referred to kind of like, that finding that only 3 large agencies were able to do this. Looking at the framework, not so much from that compliance checkpoint or checklist, but more from a resilience capability maturity model, right? Where you get to move through various phases of that. And depending on where you're at in that maturity model, your strategic partnership with industry will vary, because level setting expectations. There's not a single tool or single vendor out here that is going to be able to, that you're going to be able to contract with, and it will allow you to be compliant with this memo. So you're going to have to understand where you're at from a resource planning perspective, where you're at from a resiliency capability maturity model perspective, and then where you're at from a suite of technology perspective. And that should allow you to continue to evolve right, as your mission requires. So it's not read as like a static report. It shouldn't be read as a static report card.
It's an interesting take on what is top of mind for lots of folks right now when we're talking about efficiency, making the most of your resources. We've heard a little bit of that from you, Gus. So I want to know, how are you considering using existing investments, your existing resources, retooling efforts, other approaches to better budget for some of these approaches, and how do you then prove ROI on those? Who wants to jump in?
I don't have much control over that in my roles. That even with security tools, that is still deferred by our CISO and our CTO. Driving more of the literacy and awareness around tools, right? The understanding of how to contract and acquire said tools, right? And upskill resources, internal resources, or just drive better alignment with do your statement of works with contracted resources. And so from a data leadership perspective, I try to leverage data to help with those various decision points, right? And in doing that, I think the net outcome would or should be a positive ROI on our security tools. And then I'm always a strong proponent for assessing your tools and seeing where you need to make reinvestments or where you can reuse things across parts of an organization. I have, a group that is probably like a scientific community, and then you have policy folks, and then you have like very day-to-day mission operation folks, while in their eyes they may view certain technologies and capabilities as singular to their environment and their organization, we'll be surprised, especially if you just focus on the data, how that can be leveraged in other corporate functions like security operations and stuff like that. So just trying to figure out how to help enable that, those decision points is my perspective on it.
Okay.
So,
No, go ahead.
You teed it up for me quite well, because one of the things that I'm doing is we've got tools, we've got investments, right? And it's really difficult. We're looking to scale down some of those in the current environment and really make operations more lean and efficient. So that means we have to look internally. And one of the things that we have is that people who understand cybersecurity data often reside in just about one real place, right? The SOC. We've got SOC analysts who have some data, analysis skill sets. I'm talking deeper than just smacking an Excel spreadsheet, with a couple numbers. And that's kind of it. I mean, I don't want to, take away from anybody who may have some other data skills, but generally speaking.
I'm a data scientist. I'm offended by that.
Well, so there you go. So, but that's really where they live. And so data literacy. One of the ways that we're increasing efficiency is by partnering with our CDO and then looking across the various verticals and saying, how are you doing things? What can I take and pull in and use in my data approaches? Because, I'm good at one thing, cybersecurity domain generally. When I'm trying to figure out how to slice and dice data, I'm going to go to the experts at that. So I partner with our CDO office, up and down the chain. There's a couple of them throughout various parts of the organization, one for FTA that we work with, and then at the DOT level, Dan Morgan, in case anybody here knows him, fantastic gentleman. And I asked them to help me and say, how can we better do this? So that's one of the easiest ways, is just reach out, find out what are others doing. Don't reinvent the wheel, especially when they have the expertise, pull that in. And then the other thing is as we were going through this paper, and one of the core questions was, how can small and medium organizations and businesses effectuate this? One size doesn't fit all, right? As Jeff said. So some of it is can we leverage, the utility of the SOC and the SIEM that's already there, integrate platforms, really get these things to to work together from a tooling perspective. But the other thing is what about, growing your own, using Cribble, data scientists, pull it in. But you really have to assess where you're at in your journey and your maturity to figure all this out. You can't just hope that you're going to be compliant. And compliance, in this case, sometimes is a bit of a dirty word because what you really want is to operationalize.
Yeah.
So what we're really looking for is pull it all together, figure out who you can partner with, break down those silos. There's a theme here, and then pull it all together to increase efficiency. That's the way we're going to tackle this. It's going to be a whole of effort across multiple areas to get better efficiency across the space. So
to give a secret, because I am in industry, so I don't want any of my other industry partners to use it against us, by the way. But it is important. One of the first things that I always look at when I'm advising a partner in the federal space, hey, where do I go with this? How do I operationalize some of these components? The first thing I ask is, have you done a comprehensive analysis of the current workflows that you have now, and have you rationalized all of your tools? The tool that worked 2 years ago, 18 months ago, may not be the most effective tool that you have and you need in your arsenal today. So look about reinvesting and managing ROI. Should I adjust that ROI? Should I not relicense this and maybe invest into something different? Most folks in cybersecurity, it's kind of like building a castle. You think, I've got all these towers and I have a moat and I have all this stuff. I got all these great tools. I'm protected. No, if you don't have the human interaction and the transparency between that, you're going to have gaps, and you're going to have gaps in your tools and the investments that you've made. So from that, the second thing we look at is now let's rationalize and look at the current investments you have, because there is no one government entity there's no Cinderella shoe that fits every single entity, right? Because everyone has different. I have some open source, I have some hybrid stuff, I've got GOTS, I've got COTS. So how do I integrate all those pieces into some operating picture that gives me the transparency and operationalizes what I need to be able to do? So from that, I now have to be able to analyze as the data flows are coming in, do I need a more accelerated open source or COTS product to wrap around my GOTS operations to make it? There's a number of different facets, and if you ignore all that just by following just the policy compliance piece, and I'm harping on this for a reason, because a lot of folks will go, well, I don't have the budget, and I don't have the resources, and I don't have the manpower, but I'll make sure I can check the box from some sort of a reporting perspective. Then you've missed out a whole other side, and you're investing in a bunch of areas that are not giving you the ROI that you should be getting. So looking at your existing infrastructure, and I would say your target should be, how do I achieve 60 to 80% of what I've already invested into meeting not only just the E1, but how do I get it to my E2? And then what do I need from that? What investments do we need to make to get me to E3? Right? Maybe it's partnering with another sister agency or brother agency that has some capability that I can share certain common data sets with. So now you're starting to measure effective ROI, where I didn't have to make that investment. I made a partial investment by working with a fellow agency that uses has similar problem sets that I have. So those would be my recommendations from an industry perspective.
Fantastic. Anything to add?
Yeah, so from a great way to increase ROI is, the cyber should be an enabling organization, not just a roadblock. So what are ways that a cybersecurity program can provide enterprise services to the organization versus just simply consuming log data? So one of the things that don't hear much about lately, but is a great way of getting information, because regardless of the OMB memoranda, people don't have to make it easy on you to get the logs, right? So how can you make it easier? So your SOC, they're experts at, the SOCs and the security architects, they're experts at pulling the data in, reviewing the data. So why not provide that as a service externally? So for your infrastructure teams, for your app dev teams, different things like that, there's no reason there should be another logging facility, right? So providing that information back to those teams, providing them services. So if you're doing alerting, so maybe your SOC team is setting up alerting for performance indicators, not just cybersecurity indicators, and that alerting is going to the appropriate team versus the SOC team, right? So there's some things that you can absolutely do there to make people want to come to your service, make it so that it's a lot easier. So this is obviously very federal focused, but also there's industry here too. So you all have your own internal infrastructure, right? You're not following that memoranda, and you may find it you're having kind of a hard time getting that information into your SIMs or whatever logging facilities that you have. So that's a great way to, make cybersecurity enterprise service. And I guess it's just the key area there is just making sure that the cybersecurity program is kind of enabling the organization. And then you're not just focused on necessarily the cybersecurity outcomes, but also the other outcomes. You're making it more about what the other teams need as well, not just what you need. So I think it's a great way to enhance your ability to actually getting access to the information you need, but then also providing services out to the broader organization.
Great.
Amy, before you move on, you can't have a CTO up here and not mention like metrics and proof points, right? And so I would say like a way to get at improving ROI is through being able to deconstruct compliance into metrics, or like in my capacity, I've partnered with our security folks to try to better understand like mean time to defense, right? Or mean time to detect, excuse me, I'm sorry, again. I'm bringing the data literacy and engineering, and they're bringing the security operations and perspective to it. And then the other one was mean time to respond, right? And I think being able to help them leverage data in a way to drive that type of measurement and reporting is a way to keep track of how you're progressing in your maturity and in your compliance with that, which ultimately drives your ROI. So,
Great. Lots of an important role for sure to wrap, a lot of these data dominance efforts up. There was a white paper mentioned a couple times. That white paper is not released yet, but if you are interested, we will let you know.
Yeah.
But we're out of time. So thank you so much. This is a great look at data dominance and how that can really impact cybersecurity and move past just the compliance mindset and into really just being more efficient organization. So